September 480 BCE. The narrow waters between the island of Salamis and the Attic mainland shimmered under the early autumn sun. Themistocles, the Athenian strategos who had gambled everything on a single strategy, stood on the shore watching 371 Greek triremes take position in the confined strait. Across the water, stretching as far as the eye could see, lay the Persian fleet. 1,207 warships, according to Herodotus, though modern historians estimate closer to 600 to 800 vessels. Even at the lower estimate, the Greeks were outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. The Persian commanders, watching from their elevated positions, saw what appeared to be a trapped and desperate enemy. King Xerxes himself had his throne placed on Mount Aigaleos overlooking the strait, expecting to witness the final destruction of Greek resistance. What none of them understood was that they were about to experience the most devastating demonstration of naval warfare the ancient world had ever seen. The trireme, the sleek three-banked warship that both sides employed, was about to prove that in the right hands and the right waters, it could transform a naval battle from a floating infantry engagement into something far more lethal. Within hours, the narrow strait would be choked with wreckage and bodies, the Persian fleet would be shattered, and the course of Western civilization would be altered forever. This is the story of how Greek seamanship, tactical brilliance, and the unique capabilities of the trireme turned what should have been a Persian victory into one of history's most decisive defeats. The trireme itself was a revolution in naval architecture that had emerged roughly a century before Salamis. Unlike earlier warships that relied primarily on marines fighting from deck, the trireme was designed around a single weapon, the bronze-sheathed ram mounted at its prow. This wasn't a supplementary feature, it was the entire purpose of the vessel's existence. Everything about the trireme's design served to make it a fast, maneuverable ramming platform. The specifications were remarkable for their era. Approximately 120 feet long and only 18 feet wide, the trireme had a length-to-beam ratio of nearly 7 to 1, making it one of the sleekest vessels ever designed for warfare. This extreme length gave it speed. The narrow beam made it agile, but it also made the ship inherently unstable and vulnerable to rough seas. The trireme was a fair weather weapon, useless in storms but unmatched in calm waters. The name trireme comes from the 3 banks of oars arranged along each side of the hull. The exact configuration remained a mystery for centuries, with historians debating how 170 oarsmen could possibly be arranged in a hull only 18 feet wide. The mystery was finally solved through a combination of archaeological evidence, ancient texts, and practical experimentation. In 1987, a full-scale replica named Olympias was built and tested, confirming what scholars had theorized. The 3 banks were arranged in a staggered formation. The lowest bank, called the Thalamians, sat in the hull itself with their oars emerging through leather-sealed ports just above the waterline. The middle bank, the Zygians, sat on an outrigger structure built along the side of the hull. The top bank, the Thranatai, sat on a higher outrigger further outboard. This arrangement placed 170 oarsmen in 3 tiers, each tier offset both vertically and horizontally from the others. The result was a rowing system that could generate tremendous power while keeping the hull narrow for speed. Each oarsman pulled a single oar roughly 13 feet long. The oars were not uniform. The Thalamians pulled shorter oars at a steep angle through the hull. The Thranatai pulled longer oars at a flatter angle from their elevated position. Coordinating this complex system required extensive training. The oarsmen had to pull in perfect synchronization, or the oars would clash and tangle. Ancient sources tell us that a well-trained crew could bring a trireme from stationary to ramming speed in less than 30 seconds. That ramming speed was approximately 8 to 9 knots, achievable for short bursts. Sustained cruising speed was around 5 to 6 knots. This might not sound impressive by modern standards, but in the ancient world, it made the trireme by far the fastest warship afloat. More importantly, the trireme could accelerate, decelerate, and turn with an agility that larger, heavier vessels could never match. The ram itself was a carefully engineered weapon. Made of bronze, it typically weighed between 200 and 500 pounds and extended several feet forward from the bow at the waterline. The ram had 3 horizontal blades arranged vertically, designed to punch through the planking of enemy ships. The goal wasn't to sink the enemy vessel immediately, but to hole it below the waterline, causing it to take on water and lose mobility. A rammed ship would slowly settle in the water, giving its crew time to abandon ship but rendering the vessel combat ineffective. The impact forces involved were substantial. A trireme at ramming speed delivered roughly 10 to 15 tons of kinetic energy to a target. The entire hull had to be reinforced to withstand this shock. The keel was made from a single timber, often oak, measuring over 100 feet long. Finding such a timber required access to old-growth forests. The planking was edge-joined with mortise and tenon joints, thousands of them, each individually carved and fitted. The entire hull was then covered with a sheath of tarred fabric and sometimes lead to protect against marine organisms. Despite its sophisticated design, the trireme had significant limitations. It carried almost no supplies. With 170 oarsmen, 15 to 30 marines, and a command crew of about 15, a trireme had 200 men aboard but virtually no storage space. Water and food had to be replenished daily. This meant triremes operated from coastal bases and had to beach every night. They couldn't venture far from shore or conduct extended campaigns without supply ports. The ship was also extraordinarily expensive. Building a trireme required roughly 10,000 man-hours of skilled carpentry, plus materials including prime timber, bronze, iron, rope, and canvas. In Athens, building and equipping a trireme cost about 1 talent of silver, equivalent to 6,000 days' wages for a skilled worker. Maintaining it cost another talent per year. For comparison, the Parthenon cost approximately 470 talents to build over 15 years. The 200 triremes Athens deployed at Salamis represented an investment equivalent to building the Parthenon 4 times over. But the most expensive component wasn't the ship, it was the crew. Each of the 170 oarsmen required extensive training to row effectively in the complex 3-banked system. Ancient sources indicate that crews trained together for months to achieve the coordination necessary for combat maneuvers. A trained trireme crew was a valuable asset that took years to develop and couldn't be quickly replaced. Athens understood this better than any other Greek city. The Athenians had made a crucial decision in 483 BCE when a massive silver strike was discovered in the mines at Laurium. The windfall could have been distributed among the citizens. Instead, Themistocles convinced the assembly to invest it in building a fleet of 200 triremes. This decision, made 7 years before Salamis, was predicated on a strategic insight. Athens's future lay at sea. The Athenian navy that resulted from this investment was fundamentally different from other Greek fleets. While cities like Corinth and Aegina had strong naval traditions, Athens created something unprecedented. A fleet manned not by professional sailors, but by the ordinary citizens of the democracy, the Thetes, the poorest class of Athenian citizens who owned no land and had no armour for hoplite service, found their place at the oars. Naval service became a path to political participation and citizenship. This had profound implications. The men rowing the triremes at Salamis weren't conscripts or slaves. They were free citizens with a stake in the outcome. More importantly, they had spent years training together. The Athenian fleet that entered the Strait of Salamis was the most experienced and well-drilled naval force in the Greek world. The Persian fleet facing them was very different in composition and capability. While the Persians also used triremes, their fleet was a polyglot force drawn from the various maritime peoples of the empire. Phoenicians, Egyptians, Ionians, Cypriots, and others each contributed contingents. The Phoenicians were considered the finest sailors, their cities having naval traditions stretching back centuries. The Egyptian squadrons were also formidable, but the fleet lacked the unified training and tactical doctrine that characterized the Athenian navy. More significantly, Persian naval doctrine differed from Greek practice. The Persians employed their triremes primarily as platforms for marines. Their ships carried 30 to 40 fighting men compared to the Greek standard of 15 to 30. This made Persian ships more dangerous in boarding actions, but heavier and less maneuverable. The extra weight affected acceleration and turning ability. In open water, this might not matter. In confined spaces, it would prove fatal. The events leading to Salamis had been catastrophic for Greece. In August 480 BCE, a Greek force led by Sparta's king Leonidas had attempted to hold the pass at Thermopylae against Xerxes' massive invasion force. The delaying action succeeded for 3 days before treachery allowed the Persians to outflank the position. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, along with several thousand other Greeks, died buying time for the southern cities to prepare. Athens itself had been evacuated. Following Themistocles' strategy, the entire population of the city, perhaps 200,000 people, had been transported to Salamis, Troezen, and Aegina. The women, children, and elderly were refugees. The men of military age manned the fleet. When the Persians entered Attica, they found Athens nearly deserted. They burned the empty city, the smoke visible from Salamis. The Greek allied fleet, commanded nominally by the Spartan Eurybiades, but effectively controlled by Themistocles' strategic vision, had initially gathered at Artemisium on the northern coast of Euboea. There they fought a series of inconclusive engagements against the Persian fleet that demonstrated both the Greeks' tactical skill and their dangerous inferiority in numbers. When Thermopylae fell, the fleet withdrew south to Salamis. By mid-September 480 BCE, the strategic situation appeared hopeless. The Persian army controlled central Greece. Athens was in ruins. The Greek fleet was trapped in the Bay of Salamis with no clear plan. The Peloponnesian contingents, particularly the Spartans, wanted to withdraw to the Isthmus of Corinth and concentrate on defending the Peloponnese. Themistocles argued passionately against this. His reasoning was based on understanding the triremes' capabilities. In open water, the Persian numerical superiority would be decisive. They could surround and overwhelm the Greek fleet through sheer numbers. But in the confined waters of the strait, only a fraction of the Persian fleet could engage at once. The narrow channel would neutralize their numerical advantage. More importantly, the Greeks' superior seamanship and ramming tactics would be most effective in close quarters, where maneuverability mattered more than numbers. The Greek commanders remained unconvinced. A war council held on the beach at Salamis on September 22 grew heated. Themistocles argued that abandoning Salamis meant abandoning the refugees and accepting the breakup of the Greek alliance. The Corinthian commander Adimantus accused him of being a man without a city, having no right to speak since Athens no longer existed. Themistocles' response, recorded by Herodotus, revealed his strategic vision. Athens exists wherever 200 triremes sail. We have a greater city than yours, as long as we have these ships filled with men. But persuasion wasn't working. The Peloponnesian commanders were preparing to sail south. Themistocles needed to force a battle before the Greek fleet dispersed. What he did next was either brilliant strategic deception or outrageous treachery, depending on perspective. He sent his slave Sisinus, who spoke Persian, to the enemy camp with a message for Xerxes. The message claimed that Themistocles was secretly pro-Persian and wanted to warn the king that the Greek fleet planned to escape under cover of darkness. If Xerxes moved quickly, he could trap them in the strait and destroy them piecemeal as they tried to flee. The message was perfectly calculated to appeal to Persian assumptions. Of course the Greeks wanted to flee. Of course their alliance was fracturing. Of course there were traitors willing to betray their cause. Xerxes took the bait. He ordered his fleet to execute a complex nighttime maneuver. A squadron of Egyptian ships was sent to block the western exit of the strait near Megara. The main fleet moved into position at the eastern entrance, essentially sealing the Greeks inside the bay. Then, crucially, around midnight, he ordered a large portion of his fleet to advance into the strait itself. The Persian admirals protested. Entering the narrow waters at night was dangerous. They would be unable to deploy their full force. But Xerxes insisted. He wanted the Greeks trapped and was willing to sacrifice maneuverability to ensure they couldn't escape. The Persian fleet advanced in the darkness, their crews already exhausted from rowing into position. They would have no rest before the battle. At dawn on September 23, 480 BCE, the Greeks discovered they were trapped. The Persian fleet blocked both exits. Ships filled the eastern approaches. Panic spread through the Greek crews. Many believed they had been betrayed. The Peloponnesian commanders accused Themistocles of leading them into a trap. But Themistocles had achieved exactly what he needed. The battle would be fought on his terms, in the confined waters where Greek tactical superiority could overcome Persian numbers. The geography of the strait was crucial. At its narrowest point, the channel was barely 1/600 yards wide. The shores rose steeply on both sides, limiting sea room. The water was relatively shallow, perhaps 60 to 100 feet deep. Most significantly, a strong current ran through the strait, flowing from east to west. In the morning, this current was reinforced by a fresh breeze that created choppy conditions. The Greeks formed their battle line across the width of the strait, the Athenians holding the left wing, facing the Phoenicians and Ionians. The Spartans and other Peloponnesians held the right. The centre consisted of various allied contingents. The entire line was perhaps 300 ships strong, arranged in depth with multiple lines. The Persians, crowding into the eastern entrance, couldn't form a proper line. Their fleet was arranged in column, ships following ships, unable to deploy into line abreast because of the confined space. The leading ships were already in the strait. Behind them, hundreds more waited to advance. This formation was exactly what Themistocles had hoped for. Aeschylus, the playwright who fought at Salamis, later wrote a detailed account in his play The Persians. While dramatic, it's considered largely accurate since Aeschylus was an eyewitness. His description of the battle's opening captures the moment when tactics overcame numbers. The Greeks, rather than advancing immediately, initially held their position. This confused the Persians, who expected a desperate attempt to break out. For a crucial period, the Persian fleet continued crowding into the strait, ship after ship, packing tighter. The leading Persian vessels, unable to advance because the Greeks weren't retreating, and unable to retreat because of the ships behind them, found themselves in an impossible position. Then the Greeks attacked. Not in a disorganized rush, but in coordinated formation, their line moving forward together. The Athenian wing, containing the most experienced crews, demonstrated the triremes' capabilities in close-quarter combat. The triremes' primary tactic was the diekplus, literally sailing out through. This maneuver involved rowing through gaps in the enemy line, then turning sharply to ram enemy ships from the side or rear. It required extraordinary timing and coordination. The attacking ship had to maintain speed while threading between enemy vessels, then execute a high-speed turn to line up the ram with the target's vulnerable flank. The alternative tactic was the periplus, sailing around. This involved using superior speed to outflank the enemy line and attack from the side or rear. Both maneuvers relied on the same principles: speed, agility, and precise crew coordination. The Athenians executed both tactics repeatedly in the confined waters. Their ships would surge forward, oars synchronized perfectly, building speed. At the last moment, the helmsman would call for a turn. The oars on one side would back water while the other side pulled harder, spinning the ship in place. The ram would crunch into an enemy hull below the waterline, bronze tearing through wood. The impact would send shockwaves through both ships. The critical moment came after impact. A skilled crew would immediately back water, pulling their ram free before the sinking enemy ship could drag them down. This required perfect coordination. All 170 oarsmen had to reverse their stroke together. Get it wrong, and the ram would stick, leaving your ship vulnerable and probably sinking along with your victim. The Phoenician ships at the front of the Persian formation were the first to experience the devastating effectiveness of Greek ramming tactics. These were experienced crews in well-built ships, but they were trapped. Behind them, more Persian ships continued advancing, unaware of the disaster developing at the front. The Phoenicians couldn't maneuver freely because friendly ships surrounded them. They couldn't retreat because of the ships pushing forward behind them. The result was slaughter. Greek triremes would emerge from the milling confusion, line up a target, accelerate to ramming speed, strike, back away, and turn to find another victim. The Persian ships, unable to maneuver or form a coherent line, were destroyed piecemeal. Ships that were rammed took on water and settled lower in the sea, their mobility gone. Crews abandoned sinking vessels, leaping into water that was becoming increasingly crowded with debris and drowning men. The morning breeze that Themistocles had counted on made conditions worse for the Persians. Their ships, heavier with extra marines, sat lower in the water. The choppy conditions caused by the breeze made the ships pitch and roll, disrupting the oar strokes. Water splashed through the lower oar ports, particularly affecting the Thalamian rowers whose oars were closest to the waterline. This further reduced the Persian ships' already compromised maneuverability. The Greek ships, lighter and crewed by men intimately familiar with these waters, handled the conditions better. The Athenian crews had trained in the strait. They knew how the current flowed, where the water was deepest, how the morning breeze affected the waves. This local knowledge proved as valuable as their superior training. As the battle developed, the Persian numerical advantage became a liability. Ships attempting to advance found their path blocked by damaged friendly vessels. Ships attempting to retreat collided with ships still trying to enter the battle. The narrow strait that was supposed to trap the Greeks instead became a killing ground, where Persian ships couldn't escape or effectively fight back. The scale of the chaos is hard to comprehend. Hundreds of ships, each crewed by 200 men, packed into a channel barely a mile wide. The sound would have been overwhelming. The thunder of thousands of oars striking water, The crack of rams punching through hulls, the screams of drowning men, the shouts of commanders trying to maintain formation, trumpets signalling maneuvers, the crash of ships colliding. The water itself became clogged with wreckage. Broken oars floated everywhere, fouling the oars of still functional ships. Pieces of shattered hulls drifted in the current. Bodies, living and dead, thrashed in the water. Men clung to floating debris, hoping for rescue that would never come. The Greeks gave no quarter. Persian sailors who made it to shore on the Greek side were killed by the soldiers guarding the beaches. One of the most dramatic moments, recorded by multiple sources, involved Artemisia, the queen of Halicarnassus, who commanded a squadron of Persian ships. Finding herself pursued by a Greek trireme with no avenue of escape, she deliberately rammed and sank a friendly Persian ship, making the Greeks think she had switched sides. The pursuing Greek ship broke off, assuming she was now an ally. The ruse saved her life, but at the cost of a ship full of Persian sailors. Xerxes, watching from his throne on Mount Aigalios, witnessed the disintegration of his fleet. Ancient sources claim he saw Artemisia's action, and remarked bitterly that his men had become women, and his women had become men. Whether this quote is authentic or not, it captures the shock of watching a supposedly invincible armada destroyed by an inferior force. By midday, the battle was effectively over. The Persian fleet was shattered. Ships that could escape fled east toward Phalerum. Those trapped in the strait continued to be hunted down and destroyed. The Greeks, still maintaining formation despite hours of combat, methodically finished off crippled Persian vessels. The casualty figures reported by ancient sources vary wildly and are certainly exaggerated, but the proportions are probably accurate. Herodotus claims the Persians lost 200 ships sunk or captured, while the Greeks lost only 40. Modern historians consider these numbers plausible. The disparity wasn't because Persian ships were inferior. It was because Persian tactics were unsuited to the conditions and their crews couldn't match Greek skill in close-quarter ramming combat. The human cost was staggering. With 200 men per ship, the Persian losses would have been around 40,000 dead or captured. The Greeks, losing fewer ships and fighting close to friendly shores, probably lost fewer than 10,000 men. But these numbers don't capture the strategic impact. The Persian fleet had been the key to Xerxes' invasion strategy. It allowed him to supply his massive army and threaten the Greek coast anywhere. Without it, his position in Greece became untenable. The Persian army, even undefeated, couldn't sustain itself without naval supply. The risk of being cut off and starved became unacceptable. Within weeks, Xerxes withdrew with the bulk of his forces back to Asia, leaving a large but vulnerable army under Mardonius in central Greece. This force would be destroyed the following year at Plataea. The immediate cause was Salamis. Without the fleet, the Persian position was hopeless. The Battle of Salamis is often listed among history's decisive battles, and rightly so. Had the Persians won, they could have maintained their position in Greece indefinitely. The Greek city-states would have been forced to submit. The cultural and political development that made Greece the foundation of Western civilization would never have occurred. But beyond its strategic importance, Salamis demonstrated principles of naval warfare that remained valid for millennia. The importance of crew training over ship numbers, the value of fighting in conditions that favour your strengths and negate enemy advantages, the decisive nature of the ram as a weapon when employed by skilled crews, the critical role of leadership in forcing battle on favourable terms. The trireme itself, the weapon system that made the victory possible, remained the dominant warship in the Mediterranean for another century. The design would evolve, with later quinqueremes and larger vessels adding more oar banks and fighting platforms, but the basic concept endured. A fast, maneuverable ramming ship crewed by trained oarsmen remained the key to naval supremacy. The Greeks, particularly the Athenians, understood what they had achieved. The democracy that flourished in Athens for the next century was built on the foundation of the fleet. The men who rowed at Salamis became the political core of Athenian democracy. Their service at the oars gave them a claim to political participation that couldn't be denied. Themistocles, the architect of victory, eventually fell from power and died in exile in Persia, ironically serving the enemy he had defeated. But his strategic insight changed history. By understanding how to use the triremes' capabilities to overcome numerical superiority, he achieved what no one thought possible. He defeated the greatest empire on earth, with a smaller force fighting in conditions of his choosing. The trireme required everything to function. Skilled crews training together for years. Tactical doctrine developed through experience. Leaders who understood both capabilities and limitations. Resources to build and maintain an expensive fleet. And crucially, the will to risk everything on a single battle in confined waters where there would be no second chance. At Salamis, all these elements came together. The narrow strait forced the battle onto Greek terms. The trained crews executed complex maneuvers under combat conditions. The rams punched through Persian hulls with mechanical efficiency, and the sea turned red with the blood of an empire that had underestimated both the weapon and the men who wielded it. The Persian admirals who survived Salamis took painful lessons back to Asia. The Greeks couldn't be defeated at sea by simply outnumbering them. The trireme in skilled hands was too dangerous, too fast, too maneuverable. Superior seamanship trumped superior numbers when fighting in confined waters. These lessons influenced Persian naval strategy for generations. But the broader lesson was about the relationship between tactics, technology, and training. The trireme wasn't a revolutionary weapon in itself. Both sides used essentially the same ships. What made the difference was how those ships were employed and who was rowing them. The Athenians had invested in training. They had developed tactical doctrines. They had created a system where the poorest citizens became the most essential element of military power. This had profound political implications. When the men at the oars were slaves or conscripts, naval power supported autocracy. When they were free citizens with political rights, naval power supported democracy. The connection between rowing and citizenship in Athens created a political dynamic that shaped the development of democratic institutions. The physical act of rowing a trireme also shaped these institutions in subtle ways. Success required coordination and discipline, but also individual initiative. Each oarsman had to maintain his own timing while coordinating with the crew. The commanders had to give orders, but the crews had to execute them with skill and judgment. This balance between discipline and initiative, between authority and autonomy, mirrored the balance required for democratic governance. The rams that struck Persian hulls at Salamis were bronze weapons driven by synchronized human muscle. But they were also political statements. They represented a form of military organization where citizen participation, not aristocratic cavalry or individual heroism, determined outcomes. The trireme made the common man indispensable to the state's survival. That changed everything. Modern naval warfare bears little resemblance to the clash at Salamis. But some principles endure: the importance of crew training and cohesion, the value of choosing your battlefield, the decisive nature of weapon systems designed for a specific tactical doctrine, the complex relationship between technology, tactics, and the political systems that deploy them. The trireme turned the sea into a battlefield where skill mattered more than numbers, where training could overcome material advantage, where tactical brilliance could defeat strategic superiority. In the narrow waters off Salamis, 170 oarsmen pulling together in perfect synchronization became the most powerful weapon system in the world. The bronze ram at their bow didn't just sink ships, it sank an empire, and it preserved the civilization that would shape the future of the Western world. The wreckage from Salamis littered the seafloor for generations. Broken rams, shattered hulls, the bones of 40,000 men who drowned in the service of a king who watched their deaths from a golden throne. The physical remains eventually dissolved into the sea. But the memory endured. Every time an Athenian politician spoke in the assembly, every time a citizen served at the oars of the fleet, every time a Greek city resisted foreign conquest, they remembered what synchronized oars and bronze rams had achieved in those narrow waters. The Persians would return. There would be other wars, other battles, other fleets. But they never again threatened to conquer Greece. The lesson learned at Salamis was too painful, too clear. The Greeks, for all their disunity and political chaos, possessed something the Persian Empire couldn't match. They had transformed the trireme from a ship into a weapon system, integrated with a political culture that made ordinary citizens into naval warriors. That combination proved unbeatable. On the beaches of Salamis, as the sun set on September 23rd, 480 BCE, Greek sailors hauled their damaged triremes ashore. They counted their dead and tended their wounded. They looked out at the water, still littered with wreckage and bodies, and understood that they had won. not just a battle, but the freedom to determine their own future. The rams had spoken. The oars had pulled together in perfect rhythm, and the sea had become a Greek victory that would echo through history for thousands of years. The immediate aftermath of Salamis revealed the true genius of Themistocles' strategy. While the Persian fleet limped back to Phalerum, the surviving ships damaged and demoralized, Xerxes faced an impossible strategic calculation. His army, perhaps 100,000 strong by this point after losses and garrison duties, sat in central Greece with no secure supply line. The fleet that was supposed to control the Aegean and keep the supply routes open was shattered. Persian logistics depended on maritime transport. Moving supplies overland from Asia Minor through Thrace and Macedonia was possible, but desperately slow and vulnerable to Greek raids. Within days of the battle, Xerxes made his decision. He would withdraw to Asia with the bulk of the army, leaving Mardonius with a still formidable force of perhaps 40,000 men to continue operations in Greece. But this decision, forced by naval defeat, sealed the eventual fate of the Persian invasion. Mardonius would be isolated, his force too small to conquer Greece, but too large to supply indefinitely without naval support. The strategic implications rippled across the Greek world. Athens, which had been evacuated and burned, could be rebuilt because the fleet had survived. The refugees on Salamis could return home knowing the Persian navy could no longer threaten them with impunity. The Peloponnesian cities that had wanted to abandon Salamis and defend only the isthmus now understood that their salvation lay not behind walls but on the water. More profoundly, Salamis demonstrated that naval power could achieve strategic results that land forces alone could never accomplish. The Persian army had defeated every Greek force it encountered on land. Thermopylae had fallen. Athens had been captured and burned. But none of that mattered because the fleet had been destroyed in a single afternoon. Naval warfare, which many Greeks still considered secondary to the clash of hoplite phalanxes, had proven itself the decisive arm. The technology that made this possible, the trireme itself, now became the focus of an arms race that would dominate Greek politics for the next century. Every major city-state recognized that naval power determined security and prosperity. Building and maintaining trireme fleets became the primary military expenditure for coastal cities. The economic and political consequences transformed Greek civilization. Athens emerged as the clear naval hegemon. The city had contributed 180 of the 371 Greek ships at Salamis, more than half the total. The years following the battle, Athens would expand this fleet to over 300 triremes, making it the dominant naval power in the Mediterranean. The administrative and economic structures needed to support such a fleet reshaped Athenian society. The trireme required constant maintenance. The hull, made of wood and constantly waterlogged, would rot if not properly cared for. The ships had to be beached and dried regularly. The tar coating that protected against marine organisms needed renewal. Damaged planking had to be replaced. Worn ropes and sails needed constant replacement. A trireme that wasn't actively maintained would become unseaworthy within months. Athens developed an elaborate system to manage this. The ship sheds at Piraeus, the city's port, could house 196 triremes under cover. These massive wooden structures, essentially warehouses for warships, represented an enormous investment in infrastructure. Each shed was precisely dimensioned to accommodate a trireme's length and beam. The ships were hauled up on rollers and stored under roof to protect them from weather. The logistical challenges were staggering. Each trireme required approximately 4 tons of rope for rigging and cordage. With a fleet of 300 ships, that meant 100 tons of rope to manufacture and maintain. The rope walks where this cordage was produced became major industrial facilities. Hemp had to be imported, processed, spun into yarn, and twisted into rope of various diameters. The skills required took years to develop. The same applied to every component. Oars wore out and broke. A fleet of 300 triremes needed 51,000 oars in inventory, plus spares. Oak was preferred for oars because of its strength and flexibility. Finding and shaping 51,000 oak oars required timber resources on an industrial scale. Athens imported oak from Macedonia and Thrace, establishing trade relationships that were as much strategic as economic. The sails, made of linen, required enormous amounts of fabric. A trireme sail measured approximately 4,000 square feet. For 300 ships, that meant 1.2 million square feet of sailcloth. The flax to produce this had to be grown, harvested, processed into linen thread, woven into fabric and sewn into sails. The textile industry supporting the fleet employed thousands. But the most critical resource remained the crews. Training 170 oarsmen to work together effectively required months of practice. The coordination needed wasn't instinctive. Each bank of oars had different stroke characteristics. The Thalamians, rowing close to the waterline through the hull, pulled at a steep angle with limited visibility. The Zygians in the middle bank had better visibility, but had to coordinate with both the bank below and above them. The Thranatai at the top had the longest oars and the flattest stroke angle. A crew that wasn't synchronized would clash oars, a potentially catastrophic failure during combat maneuvers. Ancient sources describe the shame associated with oar clashing. It marked a crew as poorly trained and ineffective. Elite crews took enormous pride in their ability to execute complex maneuvers without a single oar touching another. The Athenians developed systematic training programs. New crews would practice basic rowing first, learning to maintain rhythm and coordination. Once they could row in a straight line without clashing, they progressed to turns. A trireme turn required the outside oars to pull harder, while the inside oars either maintained pace or actually backed water. Getting 85 oarsmen on one side to pull at one speed, while 85 on the other side pulled at a different speed, all while maintaining synchronization within each bank, was extraordinarily difficult. Advanced crews practiced combat maneuvers. The Diek Plus, threading through an enemy line, required the ability to accelerate quickly, make sudden course changes, and maintain formation even when surrounded by enemy ships. The Periplus, outflanking the enemy, required sustained high-speed rowing to get around the enemy line before they could adjust. The most difficult maneuver was the anastrophe, a 180-degree turn executed at high speed. This allowed a trireme to ram an enemy ship, back off, spin around, and ram another target in quick succession. Only the most elite crews could execute this reliably under combat conditions. The Athenian fleet developed crews who could perform the anastrophe so quickly that they could engage multiple targets in rapid succession, multiplying their effectiveness. The social implications of this training system were profound. For months each year, thousands of Athenian citizens spent their days at the oars, training together. The shared experience created bonds that transcended class distinctions. A wealthy citizen might command a ship, but its effectiveness depended entirely on the coordination of 170 men, most of them from the lower classes. This interdependence reinforced democratic values in a way that land warfare never could. The hoplite phalanx, the traditional Greek military formation, was composed of property-owning citizens who could afford armour. The poor were excluded. But the trireme required bodies more than equipment. Any citizen strong enough to pull an oar could serve, and his contribution was as essential as any other. This gave the poor a voice in politics they had never possessed. Politicians who wanted the support of the rowing classes had to address their interests. The payment system also transformed Athenian economics. Oarsmen received wages for their service, typically 1 drachma per day during active service. With crews of 170 men per ship and a fleet of 300, Athens paid over 50,000 drachmas per day when the fleet was active. Over a campaigning season of perhaps 100 days, that meant 5 million drachmas in wages flowing to the lower classes. This massive wealth transfer from the state treasury to working-class citizens created an economic dynamic that shaped Athenian politics for generations. The money had to come from somewhere. Athens funded its fleet through a combination of tribute from allied cities, silver from the Laurium mines, and a taxation system called the Triarchy. Wealthy citizens were assigned responsibility for maintaining and commanding individual triremes. They had to pay for repairs, equipment, and sometimes crew wages from their own resources. This was understood as a civic duty, a way for the wealthy to contribute to the state's defence while also gaining honour and political influence. The triarchy system created interesting incentives. A wealthy citizen assigned a ship would want it to perform well, both for patriotic reasons and for personal honour. Success in naval combat brought prestige. A triarch whose ship distinguished itself in battle gained political capital. This meant wealthy Athenians had strong motivation to ensure their ships were well maintained and their crews well trained. They would pay for extra training time, provide bonuses for good performance, and invest in superior equipment. The result was a fleet where competition between triarchs drove continuous improvement in performance. Ship commanders tried to outdo each other in the speed and precision of their maneuvers. Crews took pride in their ship's reputation. The combination of civic duty, personal honour, and competitive spirit created a culture of excellence that made the Athenian navy the most formidable fighting force in the Greek world. This system, born from the desperation of facing Persian invasion and proven at Salamis, continued for over a century. The Athenian fleet dominated the Aegean, controlling trade routes and projecting power across the Mediterranean. The city used this naval supremacy to build an empire, extracting tribute from allied cities that were essentially subjects. The Delian League, originally formed as a defensive alliance against Persia, became an Athenian imperial structure held together by naval power. But the Triremes' capabilities also imposed limitations on how that power could be used. The ships couldn't stay at sea for extended periods. They had to beach every night, which meant they needed friendly coastline or secure anchorages. They couldn't operate effectively in storms or rough seas. Their limited cargo capacity meant they couldn't conduct extended campaigns without supply bases. These constraints shaped Athenian imperial strategy. Athens established naval bases throughout the Aegean, essentially a network of fortified ports where fleets could beach, resupply and refit. These bases, garrisoned by Athenian troops and maintained by local allies, extended Athenian power across the region. A city that controlled a network of ports and possessed a large trireme fleet could project power anywhere in the Mediterranean within reach of those bases. This was a new form of imperialism, based not on controlling territory, but on controlling sea lanes and ports. The economic benefits were enormous. Athens controlled trade routes, collected port fees, and extracted tribute from subject cities. Silver flowed into Athenian coffers, funding more ships, which extended power further, which brought more tribute. The positive feedback loop made Athens wealthy beyond any Greek city-state before it. That wealth funded the building programs that produced the Parthenon and the other architectural wonders of the Athenian Golden Age. It also funded the festivals, theatres and public works that made Athens a cultural centre. But the system was fragile. It depended entirely on maintaining naval supremacy. If the fleet was destroyed, the empire would collapse. This made every major naval battle a potentially existential threat. The Athenians understood this and invested heavily in maintaining their fleet's qualitative and quantitative superiority. They recruited the best sailors, paid the highest wages, maintained the most ships, and trained the most intensively. The Peloponnesian War, which began in 431 BCE, tested this system to destruction. Sparta, Athens' rival, was a land power with limited naval capability. But Sparta recognized that Athens couldn't be defeated as long as its fleet controlled the seas. With Persian financial support, Sparta built a navy specifically to challenge Athenian supremacy. The result was a 27-year conflict that devastated Greece and eventually ended with the destruction of the Athenian fleet. The final act came in 405 BCE at Aegospotami. The Athenian fleet, grown complacent after decades of dominance, was caught on shore by a Spartan fleet commanded by Lysander. In a single afternoon, 180 Athenian triremes were captured or destroyed, most without even launching. The crews, caught on the beach, were slaughtered or enslaved. Athens surrendered within months. Without the fleet, the city had no way to import food or defend itself. The empire collapsed overnight. The lesson was clear and brutal. Naval power built on the trireme was decisive but fragile. A fleet could dominate for generations, but a single catastrophic defeat could end that dominance permanently. This made naval warfare intensely high stakes. Every major engagement was potentially decisive. Commanders couldn't afford to lose because recovery was so difficult and expensive. The trireme itself, despite its revolutionary impact, had inherent limitations that eventually led to its obsolescence. The ship was optimized for ramming, which required getting very close to the enemy. This made it vulnerable to new weapons and tactics. As naval technology evolved, larger ships with fighting platforms and missile weapons began to appear. The quinquereme, with 5 banks of oars or 5 men per oar in various configurations, carried more marines and could fight at a distance with artillery. These larger ships sacrificed some of the trireme's speed and agility, but gained in firepower and fighting capacity. They were also more seaworthy, capable of operating in rougher conditions and staying at sea longer. By the 3rd century BCE, the trireme was being superseded by these heavier vessels. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, which decided control of the Roman world, was fought between fleets of much larger ships, essentially floating fortresses rather than the sleek ramming vessels that had fought at Salamis. But the principles established by trireme warfare endured: the importance of crew training and coordination, the decisive nature of naval power in controlling trade and projecting force, the political implications of who rows the ships and who benefits from naval dominance. These lessons, learned in the narrow Strait of Salamis, shaped naval thinking for centuries. The ram itself, the bronze beak that defined the trireme's purpose, remained a standard weapon on warships through the Roman period and beyond. Even as ships grew larger and carried more missiles and marines, the ram remained valuable for delivering a decisive blow. The ancient world never developed explosive weapons that could sink ships at a distance, so closing with the enemy and either ramming or boarding remained the primary tactics. The trireme had established the template. Modern archaeological work has revealed much about how these ancient warships were built and operated. Ship sheds at Piraeus have been excavated, showing the precise engineering required to house and maintain a fleet. Underwater archaeology has located ancient wrecks, including several rams recovered from battlefields. These physical remains, combined with ancient texts and iconography, have allowed historians to reconstruct trireme warfare with considerable accuracy. The Olympias, the full-scale reconstruction built in 1987, proved that the ancient descriptions were largely accurate. The ship could indeed achieve the speeds claimed in ancient sources. The three-banked oar system, long debated by scholars, worked exactly as described. The maneuvers detailed in tactical treatises could be executed by trained crews. The reconstruction confirmed that ancient naval warfare wasn't primitive or simple. It was highly sophisticated, requiring technology, training, and tactics at least as complex as any other form of ancient warfare. The trials with Olympias also revealed the physical demands on the crews. Rowing at combat speed was exhausting. Maintaining ramming speed for more than a few minutes left oarsmen gasping and unable to continue. Ancient battles, which could last hours, would have required crews to pace themselves carefully, alternating between high-intensity sprints for attacks and lower-intensity cruising. The physical conditioning required to row effectively in combat was extraordinary. These were elite athletes engaged in one of the most demanding physical activities imaginable. The psychological demands were equally intense. An oarsman deep in the hull at the Thalamian level had almost no visibility. He sat in semi-darkness, pulling his oar in, rhythm with others he mostly couldn't see, trusting the timing called by the rowing master. If the ship was rammed, he would be trapped below the waterline with little chance of escape. The courage required to take that position, knowing the risks, was considerable. Yet tens of thousands of men did it, year after year, because their city required it, and because it gave them status and political voice. The ram itself, when it struck, created terror. The sound of bronze punching through wooden planking was distinctive and horrifying. The impact would shudder through both ships. Men would be thrown from their benches. The struck ship would immediately begin taking water. The lower oar ports, just above the waterline, would suddenly be below it. Water would pour into the hull. The ship would lose trim, settling in the water, making rowing impossible. The crew would have perhaps a minute to abandon ship before it sank or became so waterlogged that it capsized. Swimming in armour was impossible, so marines and officers who wore armour faced terrible choices: drown in the armour, or remove it and survive but be defenceless. The water would be full of desperate men, debris, oars, pieces of ships. Enemy vessels might run down survivors or leave them to drown. Rescue was uncertain. Many men who survived the initial ramming died in the water afterward. This made ramming not just a military tactic, but a form of psychological warfare. Crews that had experienced being rammed developed intense fear of the sound and sensation. Entire fleets could break and run if the initial engagements went badly, as the Persian fleet had at Salamis. Conversely, crews confident in their ship's ability to dish out ramming attacks without receiving them in return fought with aggressive confidence. The Athenian fleet's morale advantage stemmed partly from their ship's superior performance, but equally from their crew's confidence built through training and success. They knew they could execute maneuvers their enemies couldn't match. They knew their ships could take punishment and keep fighting. They knew their commanders understood tactics and would position them for success. This psychological edge was as important as any technical advantage. The same principles applied to the commanders. A trireme commander had to make split-second decisions in the chaos of combat. When to attack, which target to engage, when to break off, how to position for the ram, when to back water to free the ram. All these decisions had to be made while under attack, with limited visibility, with the deafening noise of combat all around. The quality of command was absolutely critical to success. The best commanders developed almost instinctive tactical sense. They could read the flow of battle, identify opportunities, and position their ships to exploit them. They knew when to be aggressive and when to be cautious. They understood their crew's capabilities and limitations. They could inspire men to extraordinary efforts through force of personality and demonstrated competence. These were the men who became legendary, whose names appear in the ancient sources as the heroes of particular battles. But they couldn't succeed without the 170 men pulling the oars. The most brilliant tactical vision meant nothing if the crew couldn't execute it. This made the trireme the ultimate team weapon. Success required every level of the organization to function perfectly together. The commander had to give the right orders. The rowing master had to translate those orders into commands the crew could execute. The oarsmen had to pull together in perfect synchronization. The helmsman had to steer precisely. The maintenance crews had to have kept the ship in perfect condition. Any failure at any level could be fatal. This is why Salamis mattered so much beyond its immediate strategic impact. It demonstrated that a political system, which invested in training ordinary citizens to extraordinary proficiency, could defeat numerically superior forces through superior coordination and skill. The lesson applied to more than just naval warfare. It suggested that free citizens fighting for their own liberty and trained to work together could overcome subjects fighting for a king, regardless of numbers. This idea, born in the narrow waters off Salamis and proven by the synchronized strokes of thousands of oars, became central to Western political thought. The connection between citizen participation, collective action, and military success influenced political philosophy for centuries. The trireme became not just a weapon, but a symbol of how democratic societies could defend themselves against autocratic empires through superior organization and citizen commitment. When the founding fathers of the United States studied ancient history, they examined Athens' example carefully. The idea that citizen participation in defense created both military effectiveness and political freedom resonated deeply. While they didn't copy the Athenian system directly, the underlying principle that citizens should be the primary defenders of their liberty owed much to the example of citizen oarsmen defeating the Persian Empire. The physical remains of trireme warfare have mostly vanished. Wood rots, bronze corrodes, and the sea claims everything eventually. But occasionally archaeology recovers fragments. Bronze rams discovered on ancient battlefields show the engineering sophistication that went into these weapons. Each ram was unique, cast specifically for its ship, fitted precisely to the hull. The 3 horizontal blades were carefully positioned to maximize penetration and structural damage. The weight was calculated to balance destructive power against the additional strain on the hull structure. These recovered rams sitting in museums seem small and crude compared to modern weapons. But in their time, they represented cutting-edge military technology. The metallurgy required to cast large bronze objects with precise dimensions was extremely sophisticated. The understanding of hydrodynamics needed to design a shape that would penetrate hulls efficiently while not creating excessive drag was remarkable. These weren't crude weapons. They were precisely engineered tools designed through generations of trial and error to do one thing perfectly: punch through wooden ships and sink them. The wood of the hulls themselves rarely survives, but when it does, it reveals extraordinary craftsmanship. The mortise and tenon joints that held the planking together required massive amounts of skilled labour. Each joint had to be individually carved to fit precisely. The ancient shipwrights who built triremes were master craftsmen whose skills took decades to develop. Building a single trireme required thousands of these joints, each one perfect, each one critical to the hull's integrity. The economics of all this are staggering when fully understood. A trireme represented perhaps 10,000 hours of skilled carpentry, thousands of pounds of prime timber, hundreds of pounds of bronze, miles of rope, acres of sailcloth, and then the cost of the crew. Maintaining a fleet of 300 triremes meant Athens had to sustain all these industries continuously. The shipyards, the foundries, the rope walks, the sailmakers, the lumber trade, the training programs. All of this required economic resources on a scale that few pre-industrial societies could manage. That Athens could maintain such a fleet for over a century testifies to the wealth generated by controlling maritime trade. The silver mines at Laurium provided crucial funding, but tribute from the empire was equally important. The trireme fleet was both the cause and effect of Athenian prosperity. It protected trade that generated wealth, that funded more ships that extended control over more trade routes. The positive feedback loop worked as long as the fleet remained intact and effective. When that fleet was destroyed at Aegospotami, the entire system collapsed within months. This fragility was the trireme's ultimate limitation. It created power, but power that was concentrated in a single, vulnerable asset. Lose the fleet in one battle, and everything else became irrelevant. This made naval warfare more decisive and more terrifying than land warfare, where armies could be rebuilt relatively quickly. The lessons learned at Salamis about how to use these weapons most effectively remained relevant throughout the age of the trireme and beyond. Fight in conditions that favour your strengths. Use geography to negate numerical superiority. Invest in training and crew quality. Maintain technological edge through continuous improvement. These principles, established when bronze rams first proved their worth in the confined waters of Salamis, shaped naval thinking for 2 millennia. The trireme turned the sea into a battlefield where skill and training could overcome numerical superiority, where free citizens could defeat empire's subjects, where synchronized action by ordinary men could achieve extraordinary results. The bronze ram at the prow was just metal, but wielded by trained crews under competent command, it became the decisive weapon that preserved Greek freedom, enabled Athenian empire, and changed the course of Western civilization. The thunder of oars in the narrow strait, the crash of bronze against wood, the screams of drowning men, all of it echoed through history as the sound of democracy defending itself and winning against impossible odds.